Good afternoon, my star students. Okay, we're Unit 5. We're now up to Lesson 3, and it's time to go complex. Alright, so, opening is this. Basically, we got to be cyclic. That's the key word, cyclic. So I suppose we should underline that one right there. Basically means to be repetitive in nature. And what it means is just be repetitive, meaning repeating. There's a pattern. There's a repeating pattern coming up here that we're going to learn about in this lesson. So when the imaginary unit I is raised to an increasingly large powers, a cyclic pattern is going to arise. So you already know that I is basically the square root of -1. So I'm going to put that down here. So, and we know the square root of -1. Okay. I to the first power, going to be I. Now, I squared at the same time is the square root of -1 times another square root of -1. And whenever we get a pair of buddies like this, you know it comes out, so that's actually equal to -1. So I squared is going to be -1. And as you keep this pattern going, the next one would be, you would have a square root of -1 times a square root of -1. And now I have a third one. Well, the first pair comes out with a -1, and the single one here is worth I, so it's the first two multiplied together, or a -I. And then the fourth power means I get another one, so 4 of those. Well, that means you got -1 times -1, which is +1. And the pattern would continue, because if I put another one for a fifth power, now you got basically 1 times the I, so you're back to 1I, or just I. And then 6 would pair up again, and you would have -1 times -1 times -1, 3 sets, so that's going to be -1. And then you will get -I again, and then you will get back to 1 again, and I to the 9th, and so on, keeps going in this pattern, and that's what we call a cyclic pattern. Okay? Now, you need to remember basically that I is the square root of -1, and that I squared is actually equal to -1. But the bottom line is, if I'm in your shoes here, you want to know the first 4. This is the pattern that we're going to deal with here, okay? These first 4, and then it repeats after that, okay? Now, you got to watch out for something here. It says to look out here. Okay, and you got to watch out the square root of A times square root of B. So a lot of people say, oh, I got a square root of -1, square root of -1. I can put them under the radical and say, hey, that's equal to square root of AB. Well, no, not necessarily in this case, okay? So don't go thinking automatically that. Because a lot of people do that, and here's a perfect example. If I had a -1 times a -1, and you're saying, oh, well, that's equal to the square root of -1 times -1, which is the square root of 1, which is 1. And that's a no-no. That doesn't work. We already just said it comes out as a pair. A negative square root of 1 times a negative square root of 1 is actually -1, and it doesn't come out as +1. So it's not true, basically, when the A and the B are both negative. So this is the case. So if you get 2 negatives on a radical, you can't just automatically cancel them, calling them positives, the bottom line, okay? So, alright, so when raising I to any integral power, you are always going to get either a 1, a -1, an I, or a -I out of it, okay? Or write it by the pattern you saw way back up here. I, -1, -I, and 1. Okay. Another way to think about this is all you have to do is simply divide by 4. Just divide the exponent by 4. So the remainder is 0. When the remainder is 0, the answer for I is going to be 1. If the remainder is 1, okay, then you're going to get an I out of it. When the remainder is 2, you will get a negative 1. And if the remainder is end up in 3, you will get a negative I. If the remainder was 4, you're dividing by 4, you didn't go enough times, folks, so you're back to the beginning. So this is a very important pattern to discuss. So let's go take a look at the first one here, I to the 29th right here. Well, if I divide 29 by 4, it goes 7 times, that's 28, right? So what's left over? A remainder of 1. So what's my answer going to be? Well, if it's a remainder of 1, go back here. What was remainder of 1? It's I. So the answer to that one's I. If I divide 64 by 4 right here, you will get a remainder of 0. So you're going to get an answer called 1. Divide 15, you get, it goes in 3 times, which is 12, remainder 3. So that's going to be negative I according to our pattern right up here. And then you got this one right here. Number 4, you are multiplying these together. We'll do the normal thing you normally do. We go with 3. Take a 3 here. Let's see what I got here. Times 2 is 6. Times 5, actually it was a negative 6 times 5 is a negative 30. And then I times I times I, you just like an x, you add the exponent, so that would be I to the third. Well, what was I to the third? Divide by 4, what is you're getting? It doesn't go at all, so your remainder is 3, so you're going to get a negative I. So it's negative 30 times a negative I. And so you can clean that up to a positive 30I, because negative times negative is positive. All right, move on with some more. All right, so let's take a look at some more problems here, and we'll start with number 5. And let's see what we can do here. So I got a 3I times a 6I cubed. So if you multiply the 3 times 6, you get the 18. And I times I cubed, remember you add, there's an unwritten 1 here. So you add, so you get I to the 4th. And if you remember our little shortcut, I to the 4th, you divide by 4, no remainder, so that's equal to 1. So this is really 18 times 1. So my answer is 18. In number 6, you take the negative I, and we're cubing it. Well, that means I also cube the negative sign, so a negative times a negative times a negative is still negative. So that's a negative I to the third, because you got to do exponents. Remember, exponents, we multiply exponents. Times, now I got to do I to the third, raised to the 6, and we multiply those. So that's I to the 6. I meant I3 times 2 is 6. And now we multiply these two together, and I get a negative I to the 9th. Okay? If I divide 9 by 4, it goes obviously twice, which is 8 with a remainder 1. So it's really negative I to the first power, which is just negative I. Okay? So it's negative times that. Nothing else you can do. Yeah, I to the 9th is that. Next one here, number 7, 2I times that. Takes care of the exponents first, so I got 2I. I'm going to leave alone for a second. And now I got to square this whole thing. Well, 4 squared is 16, and I squared is squared. Remember, 2 times 2 is 4, so that's I to the 4th. Okay. Now you might want to clean this up first, or you can multiply. It's really a matter of your choice how you want to deal with these. I know I to the 4th is going to be 1, so that whole thing's going to be 16 times 2 would be 32I. Or I can multiply together first. 2 times 16 is 32. I times I to the 4th is really, remember, Adam, so that's going to be I to the 5th. If I divide the 5 by 4, it goes once with 1 left over, which means I just have I. But either way, I get 32I. So you can do it that way, or like I said, you can turn this whole thing here first into 16, and 16 times 2I is 32I also. So it's a matter of preference. I would have probably done it that way myself. Last one here, I've got I to the 3rd times, make that look more like a 3, and a negative square root of negative 4, which is 2I. You multiply, 2 times 1 is 2, and I to the 3rd and an I to the 1st. Together is I to the 4th. And once again, we know I to the 4th is equal to 1. So that's really 2 times 1. The answer being 2. Okay, well, let's move on. Okay, and number 9, same type of situation. I to the 7th times, you take the square root of negative 12. Obviously, that's really 3 times 4 and a negative sign. So we know the 4 is going to come out as a 2. We know the negative sign is an I, but the 3 is not coming out. So now we multiply. Well, you still multiply i's together. Nothing times the 2, so I still get a 2. And when I multiply I to the 7th times I to the 1st, remember you add them, so that's 8. I to the 8th. And square root of 3 has nobody to multiply by. So final piece here. Remember I to the 8th, you divide by 4. It goes in twice perfectly, nothing left over. So this thing's really equal to 1, isn't it? So you get 2 times 1, 2 radical 3 is my answer. Okay. And number 10, I to the 15th times I to the 3rd gives me quickly I to the 18th with some right there. You divide 18 by 4, you get 4, remainder 2. Well, any 4 is 1, so that's just 1 times the whole thing. So this is really turns into I with a remainder of 2. So an I squared. And of course, we know I squared is negative 1. So that whole thing turns out to be negative 1. All right, you got number 11 and 12 left to do, and I want to make that part of your homework. So I want you to finish those and give those an attempt, and I will be checking them in class tomorrow, all right? Have a good evening.